All right, everyone, here is a brief overview of the final exam study guide. You'll find this in the module. There are only 3 questions here on the last 3 chapters that you have covered, chapters 12, 14, and 16. First, question 1 from chapter 12. Discuss the 3, and here, of course, are the functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist perspectives of gender as discussed in the text. Okay, so here what you want to make sure you're doing is not just to say, well, functionalist theorists think that gender as socially constructed is useful. Okay, how is it useful? How do functionalist theorists argue that it's useful? What are the benefits of identifying people by gender? Remember, you always want to explain your statements. It's not enough just to say, here's a statement, but here's a statement, and here is why I'm saying that. Here are some details or some examples that support what I'm saying. Same thing for conflict perspective. Of course, conflict theorists look at things in much more critical light. So conflict theorists view gender as being sometimes harmful for people because of the way that we categorize people and we make them feel as though there might be something wrong with them if they don't identify the way that society believes they should. And then, of course, you'd expand on that. Symbolic interactionist perspective, again, expand on the idea that symbolic interactionist theorists have about gender and how it influences the way that we perceive one another, the way that we interact with one another. Think about how when you know someone is a male versus when you think someone is a female, how you may approach that person, how you interact with that person, etc. Explain how family, schools, media, and peer interactions influence gender socialization. In the chapter, there is a discussion about gender socialization, how we learn to be a male or a female, how we learn gender, essentially. And of course, family, schools, media, peer interactions, these all influence the way that we learn to, quote, do gender. So make sure that you give some examples. Don't just say family is an important agent when it comes to gender socialization. That is true. What do families do? Give a couple of examples there. Same thing with all the others. And remember, you must discuss all of them. Should transgender athletes be allowed to compete in sports that align with their gender identity, or should they be made to compete based on their biological identity? There's a controversy in the US today about trans athletes. Should trans athletes be allowed to compete on a team that is not consistent with their biological identity, but is consistent with how they identify, their trans identity? There are some people who argue, yes, that's their identity, that's how they live their lives. So of course they want to play a sport with others who are like them. There are people on the other side of that coin who argue that's not fair. These are athletes who likely have more, well, if it's a trans female, likely has more testosterone. She may have an unfair advantage against other female competitors, etc. So think about that. You may want to look at some more recent headlines or articles about this issue. Again, I expect more than a yes or no answer. You got to support your conclusion. Why do you reach the conclusion that you do? I say there, be sure to give at least 2 examples or reasons for your opinion. Chapter 14 is question 2. Describe the 7 stages of families. And I tell you here to be sure to use details and examples. So again, don't just say, here are the 7 stages and list them. Explain each stage. What happens in those stages, in each stage, all 7? How have TV shows changed in their portrayal of families since the 1960s? So there's a discussion in the book about how families were portrayed in the 1960s, and that's changed over time by the early 1970s when I was watching the Brady Bunch and Partridge Family, and then into the 80s with shows like the Cosby Family or the Cosby Show. I don't know what it was called. I never watched it. But you get the idea. And then into the late 90s with shows like Roseanne or Married with Children into today. So, in your opinion, do TV shows today more accurately depict families from, in the 1960s? Why or why not? Explain your ideas. Discuss at least 2 types of child abuse and their effects on children. Those are identified in the text, so you want to go back and review that. And 2 types and their effects on children. And then finally, in your opinion, should spanking be used sometimes or never? So there are people, again, on both sides of that issue. Some who argue you should never spank a child. Others who argue sometimes a child needs to be spanked. Where do you fall, and why do you fall on one side or the other? Finally, chapter 16 is question number 3. Explain the functionalist conflict. There's a typo. Explain the functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist perspectives regarding education. Make sure to give examples and detail. In your opinion, which perspective best describes what is happening in schools today and why? So again, those 3 perspectives, as always. How do functionalist theorists view education? Well, they think that there are many wonderful things that we get out of education. So what are some of those things? Don't just say functionalist theorists think positively about education. They say it gives us lots of beneficial things. Okay, but what are a couple of those beneficial things? Same thing with conflict theory. Why do conflict theorists believe that there are issues or problems in education? What are 1 or 2 of them? Same with symbolic interactionist. And remember, you're making sure to give examples and details to support your statements. In your opinion, which best describes what is happening in school today and why? You have been in K through 12 education. Some of you more recently, some of you it's been a while, but you've experienced K through 12 education in the U.S., whether it was private or public education. You experienced it. What do you think is happening in schools today in terms of, is it the functionalist perspective that best explains what's happening? Is it the conflict perspective that best explains what's happening? Is it the symbolic interactionist perspective that best explains what is happening? Maybe you think it's a combination. That's fine too. Just explain why you're reaching your conclusion, how you reached it. Explain the history of the education of children with learning differences and disabilities. There's a really good section in the text that discusses the history of educating children with learning differences and disabilities. And no surprise, the U.S. didn't do a very good job early on. We're doing a better job. It's not perfect, though, today. Explain at least 2 issues that still need improvement for these children's education. And there are some examples of how we can do better, how we need to do better for these children outlined in the textbook. That is it. I hope this was helpful to you as you begin to study for that final exam.